Good evening all. Here's a story called Allo, Allo, Allo. What's all this then? The period of 1970 to 1973 was undoubtedly the most exhilarating of my tennis career, but looking back it was also the loneliest. The summers were spent with me trying my luck in high-level competitions featuring many David versus Goliath type confrontations, with me usually playing the part of David. The winters, however, featured all-day-long tennis practice on my own at Linkside Tennis Club in Wanstead. This would involve serving practice, playing against a wall, and endlessly dropping and hitting forehands and backhands backwards and forwards over the net all day long. It was potentially mind-numbingly boring, but compared to school, I loved it, despite the solitude. Looking back, this was the period that sowed the seeds for the application, dedication, and of course the feeling skills required in the field of tennis coaching, a career which was to follow a few years later. Mum and Dad were behind me every step of the way, and Dad would occasionally break up his long days of taxi driving to come down and practice with me. Despite being there all day most weekdays, as a junior, I wasn't allowed to have a clubhouse key. One day, and I'm guessing this would have been around the late winter of 1972, I remember Dad being somewhat annoyed when we were locked out yet again, especially as it began to rain. He looked angry and said to me, "Wait there." 3 minutes or so later, I looked on incredulously as the door opened and Dad was standing behind it. "How did you do that?" I asked. Dad tapped his nose, winked and said, "One of the tricks of the trade, son, just one of the tricks of the trade." I asked no further questions. When the same thing happened a week or so later, though, I couldn't resist following around to the back of the clubhouse to see how it was done, and having taken it all in, I tried it on my own the very next day, with great success, I have to say. So there was I, having left school some 20 months earlier with O-level passes in English, Maths, French and German, adding yet another string to my bow, that of breaking and entering. Little did I know how useful this particular skill would prove to be when a month or so later, my day of solitude at the club was interrupted by the sight of at least 6 uniformed police officers marching towards me whilst I was on court practicing my tennis. As I couldn't remember having murdered anybody on that particular week, I was intrigued to say the least. It was a senior officer who did all the talking, asking me if I had a key to the clubhouse before explaining that during an attempted break-in the night before, one of their colleagues had been attacked and they wanted to get in to search for clues. I innocently explained that although I didn't have a key, I knew how to get in all right. They seemed enthusiastic enough about this suggestion, so I promptly dropped my Wilson T2000 racket to the floor and marched towards the clubhouse, closely followed by the line of police officers. They watched it with interest as I scaled the clubhouse wall at the back of the club, in no time at all. The clubhouse was something of a burglar's paradise in those days, with the top of it being ringed by wooden green fencing which was easy to hold on to. Having done this, I pushed the skylight window open with my feet. The gap was no more than 12 inches, but I went in feet first. With a complete lack of health and safety measures in place in 1972, I lowered myself in until I could rest my feet on the taps in the kitchen sink below. I could then release my hands and ease myself inside. I closed the skylight behind me, stepped down and walked towards the front door with a sense of smug satisfaction. Dad had done all of this a few weeks earlier in a time of around 3 minutes. So how did I do? Well, I was younger, fitter and skinnier too. Sorry, Dad, but I absolutely smashed it. As I opened the door, all of the officers were there to greet me and couldn't have looked happier. "I wonder if that's how the villain did it," said the seemingly grateful senior officer. No doubt, in this day and age, I would have had a suitable quip to reply with, but as a shy teenage boy in those days, I simply shrugged my shoulders and went back to the solitude of my tennis practice. Despite our respective talents, neither Dad nor myself were questioned in relation to this incident, but for me it certainly made for an exciting few moments in what would otherwise have been another long and lonely day. Looking back, it really does seem incredible that a young lad could have spent so much time alone purely in the dedicated task of improving his tennis. Could I have shown the same application today following the invention of the mobile phone and all that it has to offer? There's a question. Good night all.
Jack on